Welcome back to another episode of Raise 'Em Up. Glad to be here. Season 5, still kind of blowing my mind that we have walked through that many conversations, but excited because here we are on chapter 6 of Growing With. So kind of a reminder for everybody of where we've been, kind of keeping track. We're in the second of 3 different conversations they're having here about withing. We're in the middle of faithing. We'll talk about adulting as we kind of wrap up this book together. And probably the biggest thing I appreciate about this too is the 3 different zones of kind of your kids are going to walk through. So who wants to remind us what those 3 different zones that your kids are going to walk through?
First, you've got learners. Good. And so that stage is kind of that earlier in adolescence, 13 to 18-ish. And then you've got your explorers, which is 8. No, did I divide it? Not even.
No, you're right.
You're right.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Explorers is 18 to 23. Yeah. Uh-huh. And then after that, you get your focusers, and that's kind of wrapping up that college age into your late 20s, about 29 or so. And it's really cool because, I don't know, I found that to be so helpful because it's about the way they view the world as learners is different than that of explorers and focusers. Their goals are a little bit different. Sometimes just like the posture of their attitude about life and different things is a bit different,
sure.
which that's been very clarifying for me to recognize some of those things that I've seen in my time teaching high schoolers and things like that.
I was going to say it tracks for sure. Because because you think developmentally, like, of course you're going to be different. You're different. Your body's different. Your brain's different.
Yeah.
Your world is different. You're in different kind of transitions and things like that. So like it absolutely makes sense. And I think the thing I appreciate most about it is just your role then as parent or adult or mentor is also different in each of these stages, and it helps us to kind of see the difference. And I neglected, I'm sure our people watching on YouTube can see this, but our listeners are probably like this is also the season of variety because we've had a different panel every single week. So who all is here today? I'm Pastor Lee, still back. All right. Obviously you heard from
Melanie Schultz. Yep.
Jayanne Martin.
Tracy King.
Awesome. It's just great to have everybody back and be able to have, and of course, Uma's been able to step in and be a voice on this season too, as we kind of walk through this. And so I think, again, this is part 2 of faithing, which again, to really hone in on their definition, it's about exercising and owning your faith, which I appreciate it so much in the last chapter. But this one really turns the corner into faith community. So trying to figure out, help your young person navigate faith community from learn it through focusers, so from 13 through 29. And what a journey that is, because it kind of even starts us out of, and I mean, all 3 of you are parents, and so how often have you struggled to get your kid to go to church or something church related?
Yeah, a fair amount.
Or even myself.
Even
some
myself.
Sure,
mornings,
yes, or yourself.
Right?
Yeah.
Because Sunday mornings you're tired. It's hard to get up and go. And I think for me, it's different because Sunday mornings are my working days.
Yes.
Right.
You're
I'm
on duty.
Yeah. I'm on duty and stuff. But I can remember before I was working in kids ministry, and Sunday is the day that you work. But after working and teaching all week, you get to Sunday and you're like, oh, really? It would be nice to sleep in today. Or if I didn't want to sleep in, then my kids wanted to sleep in. Or, we've been doing all this. Or one of us was really excited to go and the other wasn't.
Right. I've definitely navigated with just teenagers how busy their lives get. And the common phrase in my house was, it's our only day to do nothing.
Sure, yeah.
That was like the most prevalent answer to me on Sunday mornings when I would go rustle up the bedrooms and say, let's go. And I would say, no, it's our day to go to church, But
our only day,
it's our only day to go to church. But I will say that, in those years, having teenagers, I appreciated the church's variety of worship times because I could make it more convenient. Like, hey, we're already out. We're already having a full day. Let's go to Wednesday service. Or, I think that's where churches really can grab that high school and college group is to be flexible in their times. But yeah, for sure, it's not easy. The older they get, they all have cars. They drive themselves.
And as I think about it, looking at the the different levels, your learner, explorer, and focuser, I have experienced life as a focuser. I can relate to that part, being a 20-something and not being focused on spirituality and getting, having so much energy spent in the workplace, and this is before kids and things that I lived what they talked about in the chapter, which is just, it's not that my faith was meaningless, or that I had given up or walked away or I wasn't coming back, but it was about how my focuser lens took over. And so the priorities shifted, and there wasn't always the same variety of things to catch me in a way that was interesting or something that I was ready to invest in. So some of the earlier parts of the chapter where they talk about this, I was like, yeah, it really wasn't until I invested in a grow group because I was looking for community. That it opened up the church again for me in a way where I was like totally motivated and bought in. Because prior to that, it just, and again, it's not that I didn't love Jesus, but it was something about the time of life, and that I think really truly think there is some psychology behind it, that focuser stage.
Yeah, and finding something right, and it doesn't, I like that you were talking about Wednesday. It doesn't always have to be Sunday morning.
Oh, right. Yes.
And it doesn't always necessarily have to be sitting in the worship service, which absolutely is important and we need to encourage our children to do. But I have an explorer that she finds her faith and her community coming on Wednesday evenings with kiddos that are her age, right? They're still in God's word. They're still doing that. But that's where she's like, that's my place. And she's about to go to college. And she's like, I've got to find my place there like that.
Absolutely.
Because she recognizes that is her, thing.
And that's critical for an explorer to do, because like you were talking about your focuser years. My focuser years were seminary and pastoral ministry. So like I was in church every week.
You're super focused.
And at that point too, when I went on vacation, for some reason my family wasn't going to church. I felt so strange, and I had to watch online, because that's like how I was developed. But with the explorer years, I remember very vividly, like my freshman year arriving and researching churches in the area that I wanted to try, right? And being able to do that, but also recognizing I didn't fit here. And so what did I do? I started exploring okay, well, there's this on-campus group and it doesn't exactly line up, but it's really close with what I believe. And so it took me in that direction. And so I can empathize with that journey. And I appreciate that's what this chapter is about, right? So the conversation we're having is really what comes out in the first half of this chapter. And particularly, I hope what people heard throughout all of this was, it wasn't that faith was dying or faith wasn't there, faith was absent, or kids were leaving the church. It was, that is a hard time to navigate when you're not in the same place. Or even, I would go all the way back to learner, right? So as you grow, as you are in those high school years and you are experiencing the realness of the world and the challenges of the world, and you're paying a little more attention to the news and things that people are saying, you also get a certain kind of challenge that comes in that makes that such an interesting time to be alive for you. And so you have to ask certain questions, and there's different conversations then to navigate when it comes to engaging with church communities at every single one of these stages, right? And that's really what this is at. And so what I appreciate too, but starts out the chapter, it says church is less of a place for young people to seek to attend, and more of a community with which people participate. So I appreciate it really just fleshing out what a church actually is, because there's this temptation it brings out to find the right church, the perfect church. And to again quote one of my favorite quotes from a seminary professor, Bob Kolb, the Holy Spirit sure likes to run a messy church, right? So I've engaged with a lot of my pastor buddies recently, and I continually share how much I use that. And they said, me too. I use that all the time. There's no such thing as a perfect church, but you're in the right place. So wherever it is that God has you plugged in, start just asking certain different questions that are at play. I mean, at least that's the heart of what I take from this chapter. What else were you seeing as you walked through this chapter then?
I think I saw a little bit of just saying, what are the other things you're doing? What feeds into what you're saying. How are you praying? How are you doing devotions? How are you connecting with other believers, other people of faith? So where you may not be worshiping corporally on Sundays in all of these phases of your life, that faith is still growing and still, you're still exploring. I think that's the most important thing in those phases. So they had some good questions to kind of ask your child to be engaged with them and not be complacent. We had talked about how important that balance is. You don't want to be over-focused on their church attendance every Sunday, but you don't want to be complacent about them being disconnected.
Yeah, so there's that balance between,
Yeah.
And what's the key word, right, of the whole thing is engagement. So you're still engaging. There's still something to be done, but it's not this like, oh, this didn't happen. You're not there. You're not this, blah, blah, blah. Did you go to church today? Like all this stuff. It's more of an engagement of just the faith conversation that happens in the engagement and the conversation about identifying, finding, or learning, exploring, or focusing in on a faith community.
And I like that this chapter really highlights that in previous generations, church, regular church attendance was an indicator of like lasting faith and sticky faith, so to speak. But in this generation, that's not the case. And that's why we're changing the way that we view it. It's because we need to be aware of how this generation is unique and different from previous generations. And so it's not always an indicator that, that there's a lapse happening. So I really appreciated that we're not just hanging on to a checklist of, if your kid's drifting away from the faith, whether their butt's in the pew or not.
That's right.
That's just not the case.
I think as a parent, I probably struggled with that a little bit with my first one in college because like she's a researcher. So she started like researching all the opportunities and places for her to go to church in her town that she was going to college in, and didn't really find the right one. And, she would go and say, well, I don't know if anybody else would go to that church with me. All my friends are going to this church, or when I went to that church, I didn't really feel like I went to church because she had come from a certain, style of worshiping, right? So eventually, I think she kind of gave up on the Sunday morning services. And her at the time boyfriend was, kind of committed to doing Bible studies together.
Sure.
So I would say, did you think about going to church today? And she was like, well, Mom, we did like 2 hours of a Bible study together today. And I said, well, it's really not church,
Sure.
But then I had to kind of change my view of like, well, that is, honestly, you're
That's
in
great.
the Word, you're working together, you're processing through, you're growing, you're exploring what you think about things. So I had to kind of change my view on, maybe I was of that older mentality saying, no, your faith is about going to church. Like when you're at church, your faith is growing. But I think there are so many other ways of this generation to have that too.
And again, that's not to say that corporate worship is not important
Absolutely.
or that that there's not something to be gained there. This chapter is very balanced in saying
Both matter.
Both matter,
Yeah.
but don't overly fear
Right.
one or the other.
And it's a phase, right? You're not where you are
phase.
going to be. So like when you're in college for 4 years, that's not, you're not going to spend your whole life in that town 90% of the time, right? You're going to go back to where your life is or find a new place to be. But that's where you're kind of transitional almost. So I could see where college parents probably struggle with this a little bit. Like how connected is my kid to their like some kind of group? They talked about that. I hope it was in this chapter where it was like college churches.
Yes.
Is that this chapter?
Young adult ministries and
Yes.
parachurch ministries. Yeah, exactly. Well, and I want to get into that, but I also want to lean into the tension that we're talking about, right? Because it is interesting, right? So Fuller Youth Institute, very parachurch in a sense, right? Because they're very cross-denominational. But like part of the tension too is like, we do have this certain belief and understanding about what corporate worship is as we come together. And so that's why the tension is so strongly there, because it is so important to gather together as the church, right? Not at church. Because at least from our Lutheran background, right, what is happening in church is we're on the receiving end of God's word, which does happen in Bible study, but then also when it comes to the practice of like communion, we have a very unique in an extent perspective of communion where God is actually coming to us, right, in his body and in his blood. And again, not to diverge to a conversation about communion, but that's why it's so important. And there's a unity of the church that happens. We call that, the fancy theological term is the visible church. So where God's word is rightly preached and his sacraments are rightly administered, that is where the church is. But then you have this invisible church, which is exactly what we're talking about.
Right.
This like all believers in the entire world that believe in Jesus and what he came to do and who he is in all of his fullness, right? That's the invisible church, and that faith is practiced in a whole lot of different ways. So there's this really cool balance that I appreciate that we're acknowledging because of these unique stages, particularly that explorer stage and the learner stage. I can see, because focuser gets so interesting because eventually you do return to having that established faith community piece.
Yeah. Since we're kind of talking about just kind of like what we saw in the chapter, from starting at the learners, because I have one of those too, right? The being willing to hear questions and to talk about difficult topics.
Yes, exactly.
With them, those that are, those STEM-minded children, which I totally have, that are asking those scientific questions. And
how does that work?
Yes, absolutely. And being willing and open to talking to them, and also being willing to say sometimes, I don't know.
That's
what faith is. Sorry, baby.
That's a really good question. How can we dig into that?
Being willing and not afraid when they start asking those tough questions. And that's where having that church community can come in as a valuable role, as a big, like, I want to say like safety net.
Yes.
I don't know, but hey, let's go talk to next gen pastor. Let's go talk to the youth pastor. Let's go talk to this older person that you're comfortable
Why are you
with.
pointing at me?
You're not older than me. You're younger than me. Let's go find someone else that you can talk to. But having people in the church that you've identified that are able and willing to also answer and listen to the tough questions and have those tough conversations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of things about this chapter that I want to point out. One is that if you're in the middle, like if your kids are already in college or beyond, if they're out of the house already, some of this is kind of going to be, okay, what do I do now? But if you're in the preparing stage, conversation is going to be absolutely key to helping that transition occur well.
For sure.
And that's where it goes back to that definition that it started with, right? Church is not a place that you attend, right? It's a place where you engage. And one of my other favorite phrases of the chapter is how church is a conversation starter.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
So ways to leverage that conversation that you're talking about, no matter what stage your kid is at or whatever the young adult is that you're walking alongside of, letting it be this place that you can ask certain questions. And that's where we get in some really fun stuff on page 184. So this is kind of the second half of the chapter, but this is definitely where I saw the meat of the chapter. And I'd love for us just to walk through some of the different ways that church can be that conversation starter by asking certain questions. And so it kind of, and now keep in mind, like Growing With is somewhat of a partner book to Growing Young, which Growing Young was targeted at churches, and just kind of saying, and I appreciate the Growing Young research so much because it kind of highlights it at the top of 184 right here. There wasn't some sort of giant trend program-wise that they noticed in churches that were growing in engagement with young people. So it wasn't
a young adult ministry
contemporary
program
or traditional or young adult, or they have the all-star rock star pastor or whatever. It was actually just some really basic things. Like it highlights, I think I heard at least one in the chapter, like prioritizing young people everywhere. So in other words, you see that there's a priority in the budget and the space and the
timing,
who talks, schedules. Another one that I appreciate deeply was just empathy. So a church that listens. And then a third one that was really important to us was, I say it's really important and then have the brain freeze, was just I know Keystone Leadership was one of them. So that was giving young people load-bearing ways. Oh, it was warm community, fueling a warm community. That was the big one. So again, it's just like, hey, be nice. Because I think, have I told y'all the story? Have I told you the story of the millennial presentation I want to give? I went to conferences in like my end of seminary time. And I can't tell you at that time, now it's Gen Z, but it used to be how to engage with millennials. Like you would see at least 8 people presenting on this. And like the things people said, as a millennial myself, I was kind of like, that's what you think?
Oh
No.
gosh.
So I was like dead set that I was going to give my own presentation on how to reach millennials. And I was going to start it out by saying, you know what? I've done a whole lot of research into it. I've lived it myself. And so this presentation that I'm about to give you is the fullness of everything I have to say about how to reach millennials. So we might as well get started. Don't be a jerk.
There
Any
you go.
questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because at the end of
Yeah.
the day, that's what it is like, as long as if we're not
Yeah.
like the overbearing, if we're willing to engage, if we're willing
Highly
to be
judgmental. Or,
exactly, if we're willing to be curious and have conversations, then you're going to track with people in general. Because who wants to be friends with a jerk, or who wants to be with someone that wants to control you and things like
Yep.
that? And that definitely finds itself. So again, a warm community, prioritizing young people, listening, keychain leadership, that kind of thing. And I'm missing the other two. Oh, being good neighbors. And I'm missing number 6 that somebody that knows growing young will call me out on. But looking at this page, like let's kind of walk through some of these questions where church really can be a conversation starter when your kid does go. So even if they're in whatever stage they're in, learner, explorer, focuser, these are great questions to ask. Who wants to get us started?
You want to go?
Oh, well,
Or
it
questions to
starts
ask
out by
yourself.
looking at,
Yeah.
so looking at your church, and instead of going on the hunt for the perfect church, realizing that where you are right now, where God has placed you, your
Could be
church
right.
is
Exactly.
the perfect church for you.
Yeah.
You may have to do some hunting. You may have to do some questioning to find the resources there. So start taking advantage of what's in your church, right? Of what's offered in your worship community by asking, who are the people in your church that you'd like your son or daughter to meet?
That's so huge, because I think even when I talk to my parents today, like my mom will mention, I haven't been at my home church in over 18 years almost. But she'll still mention names that I know because I got to know these people when I thought they were old people back then. Right now they're like even older, but like this, it really was that community and that family that I got to know through my parents, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't because some of them maybe taught me Sunday school and stuff like
Right.
that, but it was me getting to know people through my parents.
Well, and later, I don't know if it was later or earlier in the chapter, but they talk about how there was one family whose church, before their daughter went to college, said, hey, find somebody for them to connect with.
Sure.
One
Yeah.
person for them to write to, right? And they chose one of the people's wife, or I guess the man that's writing, his wife. And then when the daughter came back from college, they met for lunch.
Sure, yeah.
Right? And it wasn't necessarily somebody that she had grown up knowing, but who would be a person that you would want your son and daughter to have as a
interact
mentor
with,
or
yeah.
to get to know, that kind of thing. And I'm like, man, what a great, hey, just meet this person, talk to him. Maybe talk to the person before and say, hey, my
Absolutely.
daughter, my
This
son's
is
going to
gonna
come
happen.
talk to you.
And
Yeah.
if we're starting to sound like broken records, it's because the situations and the topics and the advice is the same.
Oh, yeah.
Because like we go back to sticky faith, the sticky web of
Exactly.
relationships.
5 people.
If you could find
Yep.
5 people, 5 adults, this could be aunts and uncles, but it could also should also include people from your church, spiritual mentors, whether a coach, a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
If you can have 5 adults that your kid knows that they can be supported by and they can count on, then that's going to help their spiritual journey, period.
Right.
And so again, if you're ready to move, your kiddo through this transitional phase, if they're not already there, these are the questions to start asking yourself, And I like on that page also, page 184, it says, what types of community would be most healing for your learner, explorer, or focuser? So what kind of groups, could your learner, explorer, focuser have on campus or meet on campus? What sort of communities would really be good for their hearts? Help them to see that, the things that they're passionate about, other people in the church are passionate about.
Exactly. And it takes a conversation with your kid to know that, right?
Yes.
So
That's
what
what I
are
was
you
gonna
passionate
say.
about?
Ask.
What do you
Yeah.
think are the coolest things that our church is doing right
Yeah.
now?
Yeah.
Like I just think of like our church right now, we have a variety of mission opportunities that happen all of the time. And so it's one of those things of like asking, if you ask your kid, you might be surprised at what they see. And then ask yourself, okay, how can I get my kid on that trip? How can I get my kid
Yes.
involved in that service
Yeah.
project? How can I get my kid doing this? Or in that conversation, if they heard about something that you didn't even know, maybe you didn't even hear it was happening at church, but they did, it's because there was an interest. And so, okay, how can I walk alongside of my kid to get them to be a part of whatever it is that's happening at my church? And what, like, I appreciate the third question on this, right? What worship services or opportunities are the best fit for your child? in this season.
Yep. Yeah.
Those final 3 words are huge because I've even seen this walking alongside of families. Like as a kid, this was what they preferred, but now this is what they prefer. And who knows, it might bounce back and forth. And when you become an empty nester, that's when you get to figure it out for yourself, right?
Yeah.
What works best for you. But a lot of times you want to put yourself in a situation of what works best for your kid.
Right
what are
now.
they engaging with? Don't force what you like best right now. Like figure out what in the church is really honing in for you at your church, right? That's what I appreciate
Your
so
church.
much.
Yes.
Where God already has you plugged in is probably the best spot for you.
As a parent, I don't think I ever once heard the words from my children, let's go to early church. Not once, right? I literally cannot think of a time where that happened. But it was one of the ways that I was honed in on their value and what they really valued in their experience here at church was when they went off to college and they would come home, they would ask the question, which service has communion? Because we commune on different times.
Yeah.
So my kids would come home and say, well, if communion is early church, I'd rather go because I haven't had communion in so long.
Sure, yeah.
So as a parent, I was like, wow, now I know that is a meaningful, when you were talking about God being, meeting us, I think that, you have to find out where your child is feeling that so that way you have the avenue to make sure that that's meeting it. And it may be in different services. I myself, like Jan was saying, don't always love Sunday morning early because I'm here early, 5 days a week. And so I'm a late church person too. So, but when your kid says, I want communion and they're home from college, you're like, okay, yes,
let's go.
I'll go.
Exactly.
Get up and get dressed, right? So I think those are all things where you can find out like what that experience that they really are needing. And at the different phases of their life, it's going to be different.
Absolutely. And the next set of questions that this chapter really throws at us is this focus on engagement. So once you do have that experience, whenever it is, whatever it is, certain questions that you can use to highlight the church as an engagement experience. It's not a passive receptive experience, but engagement. So it says like, who did you meet or see today? Right?
Yeah.
And maybe that just encourages them the next time to meet or see new people, right? Who was the most interesting person you talked with? Because there are a lot of interesting people in every congregation that you go to. For those attending online services, what podcasts are you listening to or what sermons have you listened to lately that you liked, right? If you have an explorer or a focuser. How would you describe the message you heard this week in your small group or the Sunday sermon? What resonated with you or what didn't, right? Yeah. I think that's such an eye-opening experience to have too, and to have that conversation because again, you start to learn what is interesting to the person that you're asking that question of.
Yeah. And how did how did it hit them? Was it filtered, this particular way or that particular way? And you can get some clarification and stuff. So, I also appreciate something that one of our pastors does really well, which is an application focus at the end of each sermon. Like, okay, here's your challenge this week.
Sure, yeah.
And so again, what could you, if your church or your pastor doesn't do that, could you do the same sort of a thing?
Like in the car on the way home.
Yeah, in the car on the way home.
Like, how are we going to use that this week?
What's
just
one
ask
way?
the question.
Right.
Yeah, what's one way this can apply this week?
Right.
Or on Thursday, I want to check in and let's come back and talk about this again.
Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but I'm always surprised about conversations on the way home from church with kids in the car about how sometimes they can say something. You're like, oh, I didn't even get that way. Or I did not think that that's where we were going with that. But then there's a whole new appreciation for how, God's word and his message on those Sundays is meeting different people in different places because we're all coming from different places. So
I appreciate the meme. Like I have a lot of pastor friends on Facebook. And there's always when you write a sermon that you think is really great, and then it's almost a dud, or then when you write one you think's a dud, and everybody's like,
"That's fantastic!
It's such a great sermon, hit me right where I'm at." And then it's the meme of I have no idea what I'm doing.
Yeah, it's a shot in the dark.
You just never know. I mean, and that's anyways, but it's so much fun, right? Because again, everybody hears something different, and it's so funny when people are like, you're targeting me. I'm like, I wrote that sermon on myself, so we relate. We're together.
Yes.
And then the next little set of questions were for those kiddos that maybe aren't weekly
right
attending something, but don't not talk to them about spiritual things, right?
Mhm.
Because
This
you
is
can
huge
still
for
ask
college
them,
kids.
what are you praying
Yes.
about? What are you reading? What are you reflecting on?
Yeah, don't forget
what
that part
cause
of
are
them.
you supporting? Just because they're not actually physically going
Yeah.
to church, you can still have spiritual conversations with them. How do you think you could use your education degree, talent, skills to help people
Right.
in, our faith community? And then where might you want to serve in our town, and what might you need from our church to support you?
Love
Yeah.
it.
Great
Love
questions.
that.
And then and that's that whole listening, right? They hadn't, I mean, I guess they had wrote growing young at that point. So it's like, these are just really great ways to listen to your kid, to see their perspective, to learn more about who they are and engage them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think overall, like really every book that we've looked at in the 5 books, right, have been relational, not transactional.
Yep.
Like
Oh,
just be relational, ask questions, be open to answers.
Because that's what we were
We're bred
designed
yeah,
that way.
exactly.
We were built this way.
way.
We're not transactional
Yeah.
people as much as culture wants us to be transactional.
Mm.
Yeah. And the next 3 sections, it kind of breaks it down into teacher, like with your learner, with your explorer, with your focuser,
Yeah,
the next
teacher,
3
guide,
and then it'll
resource.
wrap up with kind of the, okay, when this is challenging, what happens? But so what is a teacher parent? So if you have a high schooler, if you're in that place, what are some of the advice when it comes to your learner and the things that you can be doing there?
I like, just again, a little caveat to remember that, they talk about how sometimes high schoolers or adolescents in this phase, the learners are becoming disillusioned. That's a theme we've learned about in this book, that they're facing uncomfortable realities that didn't bother them before, but are really starting to bother them now. And that's a good thing, right? Realizing that the world is broken, that's a good thing, a necessary thing for us to process through. But a lot of times as a high school teacher, by October, you've got kids who are like, I'm so done with high school, and, senioritis kicks in and all those other things. But, they say, really, sometimes it's a defense mechanism rather than saying, I'm going to leave this, this place that I love and these people. It's easier to be like,
Safety.
oh, I'm sick and tired of this, So it's just a caveat that I thought was a good one. And not to take it personally, because it's a sign that your kids are moving, and they're moving in a new direction. They're developing that dependence to independence, and they'll bounce back into interdependence, which is the sweet spot that we're all looking forward to.
Yeah. And then encouraging them, like at church, to maybe find a role that you can lead or help in, instead of just coming and attending, right? Receiving. How can you help? What can you do as a different?
And along with that comes just a reminder that, like, they may seem so confident, but they need so much encouragement. And so,
And support.
Speaking life to them, identifying the things about them that you can say are strengths, or I see your passion, or I see how God has wired you. The fact that your heart is breaking over this is a sign that maybe God's going to be pushing you in that direction to do something about it, And so speaking that over them and to them, and being encouraging, being uplifting, because for all the facade that many of us put on in these years, I'm sure we all did it as teenagers and stuff too, there's a lot of uncertainty, because there's so much change happening and so much unknown of the future. So that's another thing, that as you're having these conversations, we're asking questions, we're being curious, and we're also just encouraging them in what God has gifted them with, and helping them to identify areas where He might be asking them to go.
And that's where I can see this huge blending between that high school, college age, right? Because this is that time period, especially the high school one, where you get to give them some choices. And they're like that pushing of dependence and independence.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I hear you don't want to go to youth group, so we'll compromise. You're going to go to Sunday school. Or saying like, you're going to do one of these two, which one are you going to do? Or like helping them to explore the different things and the different roles. Like, because I still remember vividly a student who had to be 7th or 8th grade. We had this like the first kind of start of the year thing where we put out all these different roles, explained all the different ways that kids and adults both can volunteer. And like this kid was there for 30 minutes sitting next to his dad and like trying to decide what thing he was going to try, because dad was adamant, you're going to try something. You're going to try something and experience it and blah, 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 blah. Flash forward 5 years, and that kid was getting the award for service to student ministry. Like, so it's like that kind of like he was a very introverted, reserved. He's going to be a pastor now, all this stuff.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of wild to see that journey of just, it's okay to, in the 7th to 12th grade years, to say you're going to choose something. You're going to do something because you are, again, that blending of a learner and an explorer. Like, you got to learn the differences. You can't just say, no, I'm done with this. Like, you get to try some of these things out. And again, being patient, not being forceful, giving them a choice in what they're going to try.
Yeah.
But at least it's one of those, like, and again, the end of the chapter is going to flesh this out too. But I love the blending of that all the way through college. Like, try it out. Like, eventually you're going to be that focuser. You're going to be that one that you get to make all the choices and decisions. But, like, you know, help me out a little bit. Like, you're going to try some of this stuff out.
My job is to help you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, my job is to give you these opportunities.
Exactly.
Sure.
So as you step into the kind of the guide then, right? So I appreciate how it talks about how you get the opportunity to role play. So new scenarios, because you're going to find yourself in new scenarios. Like, I found myself just recently walking through with some students because we had the opportunity this summer to go on a trip, and we visited different churches. And so getting the opportunity to practice this, it was kind of a walk with me, talk with me. What did you like? What did you not like? What are you going to be looking for when you go off to college, that kind of a thing? Or when you go into a new church, like, what are some of the things you want to be looking out for? What are you valuing? What are you doing? All these different things are going to be so important. And just walking through a new scenario. So you're going to walk in. Like, I appreciate how, like, Kara pointed out how she always encourages her girls to, like, look for someone else that is by themselves, because that'd be a great opportunity to connect with somebody potentially.
Right.
Anyways, like, kind of stepping into that guide role and seeing some of these questions. Any questions here stand out to you on 188?
I loved going into 189 at the top there, I love the part where it's like, do the people that you're connecting with respect the things that are important to you? And I think that's really important to send your kids that message early. I would say even in learner phases, you know, like, this is important. We value a lot of those statements, like, in our family, we value these things. And if you value these things, then make sure the people you surround yourself with also value that. Do you value your academics? Do you value your relationship with Christ? All of, you know, those questions there, like your vocation, how is that affecting the people affected by the people who you surround yourself with? I think those are all things that we have to remind young ones about.
Yeah, I love the deciphering a church's statement of faith or discerning their perspectives on different things too, because there is a great diversity in the body of Christ about what we believe when we all look at the Bible and what we believe when we look at different social situations. So kind of being able to, most churches put that out there pretty publicly so that people know ahead of time. So being able to discern what's important to you and why you're walking into that and things like that. I love personally as the pastor, right? If you met the minister, what could you ask them? Like, that's really important because it's like you're going to get that opportunity. So do you have questions that you feel like are important when you go into a new place? So I really love that because again, it's you are the guide for the explorer, and that's not doing it all for them. It's not doing all the research and saying this, and this is what you need to do. But it's teaching them when you go crawling up that mountain or walking into that new church, what do you need to be aware of? What kind of questions would you be asking? Yeah, exactly.
And then I like the next comments, be patient with your kids, right? They may not go to church the first Sunday they're there. They did talk about how those first 2 weeks in college, which I didn't quite realize, were so important for choices that they're going to be making, right? It's their first kind of 2 weeks of freedom. I will say, like for my daughter, her first 2 weeks are going to be on the volleyball court. Her volleyball coach is going to be all in her mess. There's no, right. But, you know, thinking about this is kind of their first foray into complete freedom. I'm not there. I am in a whole other state.
My first 2 weeks for football, I totally get that. Yeah.
I mean, and so there is that blessing, but I'm like, volleyball season will end though.
That's right.
It does not last all year long. Even though there are still things that she will be doing, it does not last. And volleyball will not be maybe a forever part of her life, right? Yeah. So there are still choices that she will be making, or that all of our children will be making when they go off to college, and how important it is to stay connected and send the cookies, right? Send them the care packages, let them know, and maybe not just to your child, to those kids that you've been mentors to,
Oh,
because
for
I
sure.
loved
Yes.
the idea that there was the box, right? And
Yeah.
why do you have that box? Oh, the youth group remembered me. They sent me a care
Right.
package,
Yeah.
right?
And even family and friends, like when your kid goes off to college, it's so important for them not to feel like mom is the one that's always checking up and checking in. I have 2 sisters, and so my 2 daughters, when they went off, I would just send quick little reminders to my sisters and say, hey, don't forget, check in with them, because I think it lands different. Let's be honest. It lands different when cool aunt checks in college versus mom saying, what did you do this week? And so I think those, just having your extended family and friends, and maybe people like, children's ministry people, youth people that, care about your kid, to just say, hey, how's it going? Just open-ended questions, just to make sure that they know there's a lifeline there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then it kind of takes us into resourcer finally, right? So when you have your focuser, when you have that early adult, right, and kind of looking at what they need the most, it kind of goes a little bit deeper into kind of recognizing, once again, you got to have that patience I talked about with the explorer, because their life's going to be different than yours. They're going to take a different path. I mean, and it talks, there was the whole like, and I resonate with this. And thankfully, I've never been in a community that like saw my marital status as my only indicator of worth or something like that. But I can see communities that do that. And so it talked about kind of just making sure that you're encouraging your kid to find a place that just values them for being them and where they're at and what they're doing. And again, lines up with what they believe and what they're passionate about and things like that, so that you really can like help them, but be patient with them and explain that. Because again, I spent a long time finding a church in college. And then again, I was assigned one by the time I got to seminary and like obviously here. But it's one of those, being patient as they try and discover what that is, and simply asking, how's the search going, rather than,
have you found a church yet?
Did you go to church?
Yeah.
So just, how's it going? Yeah, is a much more open-ended question to finding that kind of a faith community, rather than kind of pressuring them into doing something and making them feel bad. Like, who wants to feel bad about this conversation? It's a very heavy, it's a very serious conversation. So how can you keep that upbeat and again, curious, rather than slamming them with some sort of judgment and things like that? Well, the chapter ends with, I think, a pretty crucial one that again, if our listeners made it this far, that I think it's one that most parents are asking in general. So what do you do when church is a tense subject? So what do you do when your kid doesn't want to go, when it's almost like they're fighting you? You feel like somehow there's a break in your relationship with your kid over the issue of church. What advice do you have? And I appreciate just the basic layout of these. I want to see which one sticks out to you guys in your own experiences. The basic 5 things that it talks about are: ask the question why, right? So why do you not want to go to church? Why do you blah, blah, blah? Because that's going to tell you a lot. That question is a really helpful one. Seek advice from other people in this situation. Plan ahead. So this really gets into, okay, we're going to go to church. What do you worry about? What are you looking at? Blah, 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 blah. Finding connection points. That's about asking the questions of what do you connect with? What are you looking for? Things like that. And then ultimately brainstorming, which is that invitation into a conversation of, okay, this is how you feel. I definitely value you being in faith community. What can we do about this? Right? So of those 5 things, what stands out to you guys as parents or in your experience with young people?
I think that last one is the one that I gravitate to the most, which, which is, this is important, but I recognize that it's a struggle. So what can we do about it? You're inviting their perspective. You're, offering partnership. You're valuing them. Like there's so much there. That's the collaboration that we're seeking.
Yeah. And I think that connection point, the 4th one, even goes back to what we were saying about talking in the car on the way home. Just, if they're the kind of kid that's at the phase where they say, that was boring, then try to connect with like, hey, what is one thing that stuck with you? And then let's talk about that. Maybe it's a jumping off point. Maybe that was a little boring, or you didn't feel like it led anywhere, but in the car or later on, as a family, you can try to connect that to something.
Or where can you serve, right? Maybe you can help with AV.
Sure.
Maybe you can help with check-in for kids ministry. Maybe there's a place, right? How can you get involved
Or
the faith community in a different way.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I love when churches do that young too, because like you can help and serve as young as like 9 and 10, like you don't have to be a teenager to start helping in your church community. Right. And I think when you get that as part of their culture, I go to church and I worship, but I also serve, then it just is an easy connection point forever,
Yeah. And I love what you were saying. You're like, oh, that was boring. But another reaction is, what do you wish they would talk about?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
You know, and then like, ooh, how can we explore that? He's like, you might not enjoy this sermon, but man, I would love to talk about that with you. Or I don't know.
Which again is just engagement, right? It's just be engaging, ask questions, be willing to listen. I think all of those things just keep being repeated because they're so valuable.
Yep. And that's where the chapter kind of ends, is talking about how important it is just to stay engaged, stay connected, to be the bridge, right? Because that's what it is. There's a disconnect. So how do you help them bridge that disconnect to what actually matters in the conversation that needs to happen? And then the idea of valuing belonging before belief. And what it means there again is again finding that it goes back to that word engaging. How do I engage into what we have, right? Rather than just the rote sit in the pew and listen, like mentality of I did my work, I sat there, I was good, now I go home. Because that's the whole like, again, not to get on a tangent, but like faith without works kind of thing. So it's like just going and sitting in the pew and you have zero engagement, zero connection, all this other stuff. You're just
It's not a check mark.
You're hoping it worked,
Yeah.
right? But actually engaging in the conversation and valuing belonging and getting to know the people sitting next to you. That's when church is the beauty of what the New Testament describes.
And a
Yeah,
lot of times the belief follows the belonging.
exactly.
Right?
For sure.
It's Jesus.
I love that.
I see that
It's Jesus
all
who
the
reaches
time.
out,
Yeah.
in connection, and belief follows.
Opens doors.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess I'll give my little qualifier because like I'm always afraid of the theological police too, right? Like of the whole like I have my beliefs. I mean, there's a reason why I'm a pastor in a Lutheran church, right? I have those. There's no doubt about it. Like, and so that will always, no matter what happens in my life, guide where I go to church or what I want to do. But it's also like if I just have that, I can find myself very isolated very quickly.
Right.
Because there's this connection and engagement that is essential to being a human being the way God created us and designed us to be. That if that's absent, then who cares, right? What my perspective is, right? Or what my convictions are.
Well, and the Bible verse that I think of is even the demons believe in Jesus and shudder. That just because the belief is there does not mean that you are part of that community and engaged and,
Yep.
So
I found myself with my oldest daughter getting married just shortly here, this part of like just trusting in that, what you said, that kind of hit me about like, I have my beliefs.
Yeah.
Like, I think as a mom, I just have to say, I know that she has her beliefs. And I know that she knows what is like even the communion conversation.
Sure,
I know that if she ventures out and tries a different church and she's not feeling fulfilled in those areas that I know have been foundational for her, that she's going to find the right church. She's going to look for that. But it is a kind of a scary thing, I will admit to. Like when you have an adult child that is, entering into maybe that focuser phase, right? Graduated from college, owning her own money, earning her own money, having her own job, getting married. It's like, yes, but I still want to guide. I still feel that tug as a mom to be like the guider. And I think you can, but I also think you have to kind of let that, you have a little bit of trust that they do know what they believe. And they know where they're being fulfilled and where they feel connected. And that'll end up being the right place God takes them.
And that's the advice of this chapter, right? Is learning to ask the right questions. Because you want to be the teacher again. You want to be like, no, you're going to go here. But it's going to be like, so tell me more about what you love so much about your church. Tell me more about what you believe. What do you believe about this? What do you believe about this? Is that lining up with the place that you're at? And asking in a way that's curious and not judgmental.
Well, and
and
as a good Lutheran, I guess I have given her a list of Lutheran churches in her zip code. But again, it's like that's where I have to check myself and be like, any church I would appreciate you going to any church, and I do. I appreciate that journey. It's just a tricky phase where you're like, you still feel like they're mom. You know, I think just as much as the transitions are hard for kids, they can be hard for parents where you have to learn, oh, I'm not in that phase with her anymore.
Yeah,
You
I
know?
have to grow into
I don't
a
need to give her a
resource
list.
parent.
Yeah.
You know, I have to go from being a
Right.
guide parent to a resource parent, and it
I've
results
gotta be
in
here when she's
changes.
ready.
Finding people to keep you accountable to that is important. You know, like joining book studies like this and getting involved with groups that are of people who have gone through that. You know, and a lot of my circle, I'm kind of the first mom to have.
Sure, yeah.
I was a young mom, so I'm the first one to have kids to go to college in my friend group, and so sometimes I seek out that with other parents where I'm like, oh, how did you handle that? You know, but it is a learning curve. And so just like for kids, you have to remember you're going through that learning curve too as a parent.
We're growing with them.
Yeah.
For sure.
We're what?
We're going. That should be the name of the book.
Should be the name of the book.
Exactly.
Well, and that's where
There you
like I was thinking back to some of the conversations like I had this summer, right? Of asking that question of, well, what are you looking for? And I can only speak to what I know. And obviously being a pastor, like I'm very aware of the Lutheran world in certain areas and stuff like that. So I can tell people what I know. So there's nothing wrong with recommending a church too. But then again, when they go and try out a place, say, well, what did you think? Why did you like that? What did you not like? All this other stuff is so important in just keeping that conversation going.
Exactly.
That is faithing.
That's right.
That's chapter 2
Very
of
good.
faithing in chapter 6, right? How confusing was it what I just said? Yeah, so I appreciate, right? So now we get to lean into adulting, all right? So
I'm really
figuring out
excited
what
about
that
this,
means.
so I can learn what it means.
I might need some help with the adulting stuff.
No,
Well, as always for our listeners, we hope you've appreciated the conversation. Maybe it's generated some conversations you want to have with people, whether that's your peers, whether it's people at your church, whether or not it's conversations you want to have with your kids, right? At whatever stage that they're at. As always, we just appreciate being able to have the conversation and start the conversation. So if you want to continue that conversation, feel free to share. Feel free to share this episode with somebody or engage with us on social media, Facebook in particular. You can search Raise 'Em Up Podcast. Be sure you include that word. And we would absolutely love to be able to just continue the conversation with you. So we will see you next time as we take a look at part 4 of Growing With and chapter 7 as we talk about relational adulting. We'll see you next time.